Hi, I'm Joan Agajanian Quinn, and the Junior Achievement of Armenia has chosen to bring you one of our wonderful top Armenian artists. His name is John Altoon, and today we're going to be talking to some of his friends from the 50s and 60s. I'm with Charles Garabedian, who's going to tell us a few things that he remembers about John Altoon. When did you meet John?
I met John in probably the early 60s, and it was, I think, as just simply through reputation that I had heard a lot about him and had seen his work here and there at Ferris, etc., etc. And to me, he was sort of represented as a extremely talented but very troubled kind of a man. And eventually, we became acquainted when we had studios within a block of one another down in Ocean Park. I was on Pier Avenue, and I think he was on Navy, sharing a studio with Larry Bell, he was. And right next door to me there was a pool hall, and we played pool 3 or 4 times a week, and John would join us every now and then. He would play, and he was a pretty good pool shooter. And we did have studio visits, and I can recall he came by my studio one day and he was looking at the work, and I had a large painting of a crucifixion, and John looked at it, and he sort of looked at it for a while. And he said, "You know what?" He says, "You know who that is?" And I says, "Yeah." And he says, "It's Marilyn Monroe." And that was that, and I never understood what he was talking about until just maybe recently I get some notion about what he meant. And on my visit to his studio, it was interesting, because at that time, I think this was mid-60s, he was doing what he said he was doing, a painting a day, and these were relatively large oils, and he said he was doing a painting a day. He would get up in the morning, he would start to work on this picture and, you know, devote his day to this particular painting and go to bed at night. Next morning, he said he'd wake up and look at it. If didn't like it, he'd trash it and just simply start over again, the same process. And as to our being fellow Armenians, I think we acknowledged it, but I'm not sure about him, but I think what is true about me was true about him, that I was brought up in almost a totally non-Armenian kind of a way. I never learned the language, never learned anything about it. And I had a feeling that John was in a similar situation, but I'm not sure. But he was a very sweet person, I think, an extremely kind of generous and human person. And this sort of came through, that he was a very giving kind of decent and wonderful, and I think a great painter, just, you know, beautiful paintings.
Did he talk about your work?
Only about Marilyn Monroe, and that was it.
This is George Herms. He was blowing his groove tube in Malibu. George was one of the original hippies, and he knew John in the 50s and 60s up until the time of his passing. George Herms.
All right. My favorite memory of John Altoon is when he came to Hermosa Beach, to my home, spent the night, and when he left, there was a drawing left behind that had all these looping shapes in it, very characteristic of John's drawings. But he had written down in one corner that he loved to draw as a child, but one day his mother had left his crayons on the stove. So hence all these drooping things. And I saw John many times. I saw him with Artie Richer. We woke him up one morning, and Artie and John started drawing, painting in the air, these dripping things down on a thing. It was one of the first times. I'm about 22, and I'm seeing two heavyweight artists interact. And then a few years later, I had an exhibition on La Cienega of my iris firewater collages and the zodiac boxes. There was a group of artists across the street drinking. The only one that came over to look at my work was John Altoon. And John took a look at these iris firewater collages, and he said, "You really like beauty." And that was one of the greatest compliments I ever received. And then at the end of John's life, there was a big blowout at the old Pasadena Museum on Los Robles. And there was an incredible party going on. And John was there and I was there. And then I saw him about 2 weeks later, and he came up to me and he did that thing where you pat somebody in the chest, and he said, "Listen, man, at Pasadena, I was talking about painting, and the more serious I got, the more you laughed." And this was, at somebody's backyard in Venice, and then a couple weeks later, John was gone.
Did he ever talk to you about his ethnic background? Did you ever get a feeling of his Armenianness?
Well, I'll have to be honest with you. To me, John was a unique individual. I know that he brought all that Armenian emotion to his work, and that was the other thing. As a young person, to see this great, joyful outburst of living life to the full. One other thing I thought of in thinking about John is that he went to Mallorca, and Picasso saw his work. And he was the only one that I knew of that actually talked to Picasso. And Picasso didn't like the paintings, liked the drawings. Oh. And this is what John brought back. So to me, he represented like a real strong, the great flowering of Armenian art to me would have come through John Altoon.
Henry Hopkins was the director of the Heisman Gallery, which was right across the street from the Ferris Gallery. It was on La Cienega, and he knew John in the 60s.
Yes, that's true. In fact, my little gallery was right across the street from Ferris, where John was showing in the 1960s, and young artists came to me like Joe Good and Ed Ruscha and Larry Bell, and they came to me primarily, I think, because I was across the street from the Ferris, which was the hot gallery at that time. And of course, John was the artist whom everybody admired, loved, respected, had great feeling for. I think probably the one most personal memory I have of John is when he started doing his wonderful drawings like The Princess and the Frog, the kind of erotic drawing. And John, as you remember, was so determined to be an important painter, and yet he was one of the most brilliant draftsmen since Picasso, as far as I'm concerned. But he paid no attention to those drawings. He just simply did them and very often threw them away. People, in fact, would pick them up out of waste cans and take them home. So he just simply did hundreds of them over a period of time. But toward the end of his life, unfortunately toward the end of his life, I wrote to him and said, "John, you've done these wonderful drawings, these really extraordinary drawings that have this wonderful kind of positive, upbeat, erotic content. Let me just urge you to go back and look at Picasso and look at some of the things that came out of the classical tradition. Look back to the Greek myths, look back to the history of mankind. Do your drawings from that kind of a basis, and what an extraordinary thing that would be." And he wrote back a really nice little note and said, "I'll give it serious thought."
One of the things that I think is so strange and maybe funny looking back, as a young collector, I met John when Jack and I were just married, and we had 2 little girls. We had our twin daughters, and John said, "You've got to take these paintings, you've got to take these drawings there." And I looked at them, and there were frogs jumping out of crotches and all these kind of things that I thought, how can I put a painting like that up and have little children around? And to this day, you just look at it as a beautiful graphic piece of drawing.
Oh, it's absolutely true. And of course, the content so often, as I say, erotic for sure, but the kind of erotic you could almost explain to a child in a funny way. It was because it had that kind of wonderful childish sensibility to it, which was so great.
So real.
So real, yes.
Yeah.
And one could hardly call it, it was at that time. I remember I did an exhibition of drawings in Fort Worth, and the people were outraged talking about this pornography of John Altoon. And I kept looking at it in the back room and thinking, this isn't pornography. You know, pornography has something to do with horrible things, you know, and this has to do with this kind of wonderful, upbeat sense of life and living and people and animals and all kinds of things that were going on. But it was a fantasy which John lived in, and it was very different than his paintings, I thought, and in many ways more remarkable. I think I remember him personally. I remember him best for the drawings.
Did you ever have any connection with him as to his Armenian roots? Did he ever talk about that? Do you remember anything?
No, I did not have a direct connection to that, but certainly that was an important part of who John was. And I think it had to do with the fact that many of the artists in Los Angeles at that time, in the late 50s and the early 60s, had just become really conscious of what had been going on in New York. And obviously the godfather of New York abstraction was Arshil Gorky, another Armenian. And Altoon was kind of our Gorky, I guess you'd say, on the West Coast, because number one, he had that same kind of open, ebullient, you know, humanistic temperament, and he would sit for hours and talk to young artists, and he would talk to people, you know, just with the sheer pleasure of communication, and that meant so much to these young artists that it was meaningful. I'm sure that's his Armenian heritage. I just no doubt about it.
Gorky was very influenced as well, the same way as you sent John to talk to Picasso and look at Picasso's work. Gorky had those influences as well.
Yes, he did. Yes, he did. And of course, the other thing about John is that, you know, at that time, the art that seemed to be dominating the Los Angeles scene was what we would call light and space, or fetish finish, or, you know, the high gloss techniques and experimentation. And here was John still working in this very expressionistic style, quite counter to what LA was about. But we needed that point. We really needed that focal point.
This is a photo of the original Ferris Gallery artists. Ed Moses was in that stable of very avant-garde, on-the-edge artists. He knew John during that time. Ed?
Yeah, I first came across John in 1957, could have been 56, 57. I met him through Walter Hopps, and there was a little gallery that Walter had, and Ed Kienholz was having a show there. George Herms was there, Wally Berman, and John Altoon. And John Altoon was one of these magnetic people, full of passion, pathos, humor, sensuality, sexuality. John was everything. Everybody's ideal of, or at least this group of people that I knew, way an artist behaved, the way he looked, the way he walked, the way he talked, and his great prowess with women.
Tell us about that.
He always had several women around him at openings and various events, and he would keep them in his bevy. And one of them might drift off, or one of us might approach them, and he'd run over and pay attention to that one, and another one would go off, and it was sort of like the big rooster with all its little hens. And women adored him. He talked sort of beat talk with a beat to it, with lots of dirty words that sounded like pearls and roses to them. He would talk about dropping on his knees and give them a tongue lashing, and they loved it. And most women would be offended, particularly now. But even at that, even if he was talking that way now, I think that he could pull it off because he was such a poetic person. He had this magnificent Viva Zapata face at that time, where he had this large space between his upper lip and his nose, and it was filled with this gigantic mustache. And a lot of the other players decided to have mustaches, but none could compete with John. And he'd walk up to you and engulf you in his arms, and he was like Big Daddy, and asking about you and being interested, but actually not being too interested. because he was on to bigger and better things. He had passion and madness, and he slipped in between those two areas very easily. He often carried a Rembrandt book around with him, like a Bible, stopping you and making you look at these various drawings in the Rembrandt book. He thought that all art was a sham except for Rembrandt.
Did he talk about your paintings with you?
Yeah, he was always very complimentary. He was much like Kienholz that way. They were both very interested in other artists' work. And a lot of the artists in this particular group were really only interested in their own. But John was very generous. He had this wonderful place out in the valley with face Spain. And he had huge stacks of these 40 by 60 drawing arches paper panels. And he might do 15 or 20 in an afternoon. And he always had 15 or 20 people hanging out.
While he was painting?
Yeah.
Or drawing?
While he was drawing, he'd be talking, he'd be smoking, lots of cigarettes, lots of dog turds out in the yard with his dog called Man. And I think the dog Man was actually a female, but he'd say, "Hey, Man," and pretty soon Man became the dog's name. It's this little bitch German Shepherd that went everywhere with John. Anything else?
Did he ever talk to you about his Armenian heritage, his background?
Actually, I never knew he was Armenian until I met you and Chaz Garabedian.
Is that right?
And I found out his name was actually Altoonian. He'd removed the IAN, which is the ID for an Armenian. Is that right?
That's right.
And but he was a magnificent artist. Traveled all over. He was the most sophisticated of all of us. Lived in Spain for a while. He was so despondent over there at one time. He laid on a train track, and he was saved by somebody and put in a nut house there. And he'd spent time in the nut house off and on. But I think it was just extreme feelings of passion and concern and despondency. And I think he was caught going over a fence out at the Veterans Hospital, the funeral place out there, buck naked, carrying his book of Rembrandt, and they pulled him off the fence, the police did. And Milton Wexler pulled him out with Laura Lee Stearns and started giving him shrink lessons. And John called me one day and he said, "How would you like to have your brain shrunk for nothing?" And I said, "Hey, why not?" And it was this fantastic man, Milton Wexler, that changed a great deal of our lives.
This is a photo of the Ferris Gallery. Artists in front of the Ferris Gallery. Irving Blum is with us. He was the director at the gallery from 1959 to 1969. Who were some of the artists in this picture, Irving?
Well, let me take a look. There I am, seated next to John Altoon, Ed Moses, and Billy Al Bengston in the background.
And what do you remember about John?
Well, the gallery represented a number of artists, along with those three people like Craig Kaufman, Bob Irwin, Kenny Price, Larry Bell, but most importantly, for me, as well as for the rest of the people in the gallery, I think, John was the poetic center.
Was he the first artist you signed up?
I would say when I came out from New York, Walter and I became partners. And Walter represented some 80 or 90 artists, and I thought it was unmanageable. So we had to kind of reduce the number to a manageable number, and I thought it seemed to me then that a dozen or 15 would be manageable. And the person who was primary, I think both for Walter and for myself, was John. The guy was guilty. He was guilty of really an abundance of talent. The guy was super talented. He had a kind of a draftsman's gift that from then until now I simply haven't seen the equal of. I remember John working at an advertising agency, and part of what he had to do was increase by 2 or 3 or 4 times a drawing that somebody had handed him. And everybody in the agency, I think everybody industry-wide, used an enlarger. John would simply pin paper to the wall and do it freehand, and do it brilliantly, and do it without comment. And people in the agency noticed. And whenever he attacked his subject in that way, there was always a circle of people around watching him display this extraordinary gift.
Sometimes in the fine arts world, people think that the graphic arts are too commercial.
Yeah.
But he made the crossover.
Well, by graphic, we're really talking about drawing, and we're really talking about the skeleton, so to speak, of a painting. And John always had that, and he had it exactly the way he wanted it, and had it really brilliantly, more so than most. This gift was, he was a tiny bit, unhappily, it came too easily to him. And I think that can sometimes have a destructive edge, and I think it did for him. Had he been somehow a little more disciplined, I think there's no limit to what he could have achieved.
Did he ever talk about his Armenian heritage to you? Did you ever have any kind of direct contact with that?
Not really. He did talk about it, but his major focus was really work. And he would talk about his Armenian heritage. As a matter of fact, he had relatives who had a melon farm. And we went to visit a painter called Hassel Smith, and we brought paintings down from a little city called Sebastopol, north of San Francisco, John and I. And we stopped at this melon farm. And his cousin, or second cousin, or third cousin, and big extended family gave us several crates full of melons to take back, which we loved.
We're with Tony Berlant, who was one of the artists that John knew during the 60s, I'd say. Is that right, Tony?
Right. Yeah, I didn't really get to know John well until about 6 months before he died. I always felt fortunate. I had seen him around forever, and he was a legendary figure in terms of people talking about him. So I felt that I knew him even before that. And it's, of course, hard to understand that it's been so long since he died. And it really is true that people live on in the memories of people who knew him well, because his presence is still felt. And I even have always felt that this very catalytic person felt a real loss of his not being around. He would have been very inspiring, because he was very playful and totally anti-establishment in every sense.
What were some of the anti-establishment things that you remember?
Well, I just think he was a totally free spirit, and he was resistive to normal concepts of status and accomplishment. And he was most focused on being very spontaneous and extremely lively at all times.
Being very lively reminded me of one of the stories you were telling about Mount Sinai.
Oh, just that he was famous as a seducer.
And when he was in the hospital, talking about
supposedly,
seducing?
yeah, that he had seduced one of the lady psychiatrists and one of the nurses, and that had caused a conflict. And I believe it's true. It's hard to sometimes know where the line of people's fantasies about John and what was really there stopped and added. But he was extraordinarily sensitive and physically beautiful person.
Did he come to your studio and talk about your work?
In this last period that I knew him, he had discovered my studio was so close to his studio, and he would come over and he'd say, gee, it's 11 o'clock in the morning and I've already used 10 big sheets of that really expensive paper. And I guess I better cool down a little bit, rethink. And so he would come over and just sit around. Gestural artists have a lot of off time. If you do the kind of art I do where you're just steadily, all the time making it happen, but a gestural artist only has to be right an hour a day and you can get a full production.
Did he come out? Did he have lunch with you? Is that?
Yeah, he'd often have lunch. And we'd go out on the pier, and his idea was you buy a piece of smoked swordfish and you sit there on the edge of the pier and philosophize about life.
Did he ever talk to you much about his Armenian heritage?
I remember this came up because of his, and the Watts riots, and his asserting that he was a third world person, and don't stand too close. And he also told me at the time that he had been raised in this neighborhood that was largely Jewish, I believe in Fairfax, that he was the Shabbos goy who would run from house to house for a quarter to turn on the stove, and that the combination of being part Indian, part Armenian, and then having to associate with Jews, it was just too much, a third persecuted group. But I think we all have in our minds just this exuberant spirit. And the last time I saw him was at an opening of David Stewart where we both showed, and somebody kind of aggressively bumped into me from behind, and I turned and here was John's big face an inch away from my face, and he said, "Quick, nobody's looking, kiss me," and he just shoved his tongue all the way in my mouth, and I'll always remember this laughing face and flying hair as he turned away.
Laddie John Dill knew John Altoon the last couple of years of his life. Laddie was working at Art Services during the day. He was driving Nick Wilder around. You were doing a lot of things, weren't you, Laddie?
Yeah, well, actually, I was a printer at Gemini, which was next to Art Services at the time.
Oh, you were?
Yeah, and then I was also, a little previous to that, I was Nick Wilder's chauffeur. That's a whole story in itself. But I consider myself not a close friend of John's, but more of a John Altoon observer, because my contact with John was every afternoon. John used to come in to Gemini, and basically his reason for being there was to give Ken Tyler a lot of shit. He'd wear a Cameron T-shirt, and he was a very powerful man. And he would come in and just kind of joke around with him and walk around and just completely mesmerize everyone in the place. So I got to know him a little bit during those meetings, and obviously a very charismatic guy. And then when it got to a point where I could really get to know him, unfortunately, he passed away.
Did he ever try to give you any pointers while you were printing?
Well, yeah. I mean, John basically was a great advice giver, and he would walk around the shop and just basically fine-tune everything right at Tyler's side.
Did he know what he was doing?
Yeah, he had some pretty good solutions to things, But Tyler, was a different kind of personality, let me put it that way. So he ruled the shop. Yeah.
Did John ever talk about his being Armenian? Did you ever overhear him saying anything like that?
Was he Armenian?
Here's a picture of Patricia Faure in the center of this gallery opening with Craig Kaufman. We've been doing our interviews at the Patricia Faure Gallery in Santa Monica, and Patti has so many recollections about John that we had to have her tell us what she remembers.
The first thing that I remember is the shock at seeing his paintings in the 50s, when most of the abstract painting that I was familiar with was mud-colored. And suddenly there was this incredible palette of almost decorator's colors, pinks, purples, oranges, what have you. And it was something that really took hold in California and continued certainly in Billy Al Bankston, not that it came from John, but it certainly got a chance to develop with John leading the way. And it was an extraordinary thing to see. It was just completely unheard of, as far as I was concerned at any rate.
Were you one of his only women friends?
No, he had more women friends than you could imagine. In fact, today, where I'm the only woman speaking in this interview planned for John, I can't help but think that were he here, it would be entirely the opposite. And there'd probably be one guy and 15 women.
Did you have a gallery at that time?
No, I was a young woman. The picture with Craig Kaufman was taken in the 50s. And then I continued with Asher Faure, with Betty Asher. In 79 we opened. And now that Betty is no longer with us, I opened up the gallery under my own name in 1994 here at Bergamot Station.
Do some of your artists have that same sensibility as John?
Absolutely. I mean, the same attention to color. Everybody has different sensibilities, and he was just such a unique artist, John, that his equal isn't even around or anything like him. But that palette certainly remains. And I think it's very interesting. It's a very California subject by today.
He was born here.
He was
born in California. He went to Dorsey High School, and he was like a native son. I mean, he really did become a part of the California landscape, and I think you've found what put him there.
Yeah, it really was amazing. But he also had this amazing touch. He also was this extraordinary draftsman. That was probably what put him apart from other people more than anything.
Do you remember any of his Armenian roots? Do you remember him talking about anything that showed his ethnic background?
Not in particular. I really don't.
Did he seem different to you? And
he seemed like the quintessential artist. He was everybody. Physically, he looked like everyone's idea of an artist that comes from movies and books and that sort of thing. He was just that.
Was it natural, or do you think he contrived that look?
I think it was totally natural. Yeah, absolutely. He was totally at ease with himself. Miserable a lot of the time, but at ease with himself.
Who were the other women, serious women, not girlfriends that were coming and going, or young tarts, as some of the other people said? Who do you remember in his life?
I remember Faye Spain. And later on, when he married Babs, I had known Babs before, and also a very good friend of his is Pauline Annan. And she was a great, great friend of his.
Did he have serious conversations with Pauline?
I bet he did. I wasn't privy to them there. I'm sure he did.
Dennis Hopper was one of the art crowd during the time when John was working in Los Angeles. Dennis not only collected art, but he was a photographer. He had shows at the various galleries, and this picture shows Dennis with a group of the artists at one of the parties at his house. Dennis, how involved with the artists were you when you were working here in LA?
Well, actually, I exhibited with the artists, with most of the people that we're talking about. I showed at the David Stewart Gallery. So when John Altoon had a moment when he was showing at the Ferris Gallery with Irving Blum, and he came in the night before his opening. By the way, these were the greatest paintings I'd ever seen. They really transcended any kind of abstract expressionist thing, because we were all born in a time where we were emulating the abstract expressionists. We were third generation abstract expressionists. So John had done this POP series, which is the most wonderful lyrical raw canvas with great shapes and sea-like creatures, and it was just marvelous. So he came in the night before, and he sliced each one of them with a knife and destroyed the whole series. So Irving was rather perturbed by this and decided not to show John anymore. And that was the day that I took John from the Ferris Gallery to the David Stewart Gallery up the street. It was then called the Stewart Prima Gallery, or Prima Stewart, I don't know.
He had a long life at the Stewart Gallery then, didn't he?
Yeah, quite a while.
Tell us a little bit about the idea that he launched the type of studio that artists are using.
Yeah,
so
he
much.
was the first one to show us really how to make studios. He had a loft downtown that he converted into a painting studio for himself, and then he showed the guys how to take storefronts and make them into studios. He was quite resourceful. There's the great story about when he was in Spain and he became depressed. He's a great artist, and he became depressed at times. And he was one of my favorite painters, actually. I've collected a lot of his work through the years. So he was in Spain, and he decided to kill himself, and he laid himself down his head down on the track when the train was coming. The train switched onto another one and went right by him, and he decided, well, maybe he should live.
You also were instrumental in some of his love life.
I did. I introduced him to Faye Spain, an actress, which he married, and I think they had some fun.
How could she deal with his craziness at that time?
I don't know that she did.
Oh.
Yeah, very well. They were together a few years, though. Yeah. So.
Did you photograph him?
I did. I took a couple of photographs. As a matter of fact, one of them was a poster. When it showed in my photograph showed in Lucerne, Switzerland. They used John as the poster, and it was a big head of him just as he had lit a cigar, and it was all smoke curling all around him. It's beautiful.
Was it hard for you to separate your acting life and your art life? Did they meld together?
No, it's very difficult to. There are no artists, actors in the fine arts. There never have been. There's no history of that at all. There's none now. So to be able to be shown in the areas that I wanted to be shown in was almost impossible. Being an actor did not help me in any way.
And do you remember, many people thought of John as an actor, and I wondered if he really made his persona as an actor would make his persona, or was he really real?
Oh, John was wonderful. John was, I don't think there's anything unreal about actors' personas, you know. But I used to love to watch John paint because he would put on the music, and it was almost like a dance, and it was like a performance in a way. But it was a performance he was doing through himself. It was very, very concentrated, but it was wonderful to watch him.
Do you remember anything that he ever said that tied him to his ethnic background, being Armenian?
Not really. He may have made some jokes at times about it. But I mean, the reason that I really know he's Armenian is because Tony Shafrazi is my art dealer. And Tony is Armenian. And Tony pointed out to me that John was Armenian. And I said, well, I already knew that, but I'm not sure how I knew that, you know, except that John Altoon was just a bigger-than-life guy, a really important person in my life, you know.
This is a very famous photograph of Billy L. Bankston, taken by Dennis Hopper. You've probably seen this many, many times and never knew who it was, but Billy L. was a close friend of John Altoon's, was a member of the Ferris Gallery in the 60s, and he's going to tell us some of the things he remembers about John.
That's very close. Ferris Gallery in the 50s.
In the 50s?
And that's when I met John. And like everyone else, I'm sure that's on this, John was my best friend. I'm sure that everybody has said that. And the second thing I want to say, I was with John the night he died, and as far as I'm concerned, that's the only bad thing he ever did. He was as nutty as a fruitcake and as good a friend as anybody could possibly be. And while we're talking about friendship, I was having a show in, I think, 61 at the Ferris Gallery, and John came in while I was hanging. And he was with a Japanese artist, Japanese aside, it doesn't make any difference. He had just spent 3 days with him in La Jolla at his place. And they were looking at the show, and we were shooting the breeze, and John pulls me aside in the back room and says, "Billy, who's my friend?" That sort of sums up the way John thought of everyone. It didn't make any difference what your name was, you always became John's best friend. John not only was a best friend, he was an artist, and you don't say that about many people. He more or less lived art and women, I think, and friends. And every morning he used to, in the last years of his life, come over to my place and play pool. This goes back to names again. He always called me Albert. I don't know. Albert. And we would shoot pool for a couple hours, and then he would go eat at a little restaurant at the beach. And this is another thing I'm sure killed him, because it was a greasy spoon. And he consumed an incredible amount of grease at that restaurant. As John was an Armenian, he said he was.
Did he talk to you about being Armenian?
No, he said he was Lebanese. He never ate any Armenian food except when he came to your house.
Remember when he came over?
Absolutely. And we took a lot of food home, as I recall.
That was that one night. It was the week before he passed away, and my cousins were doing the catering.
It was spectacular.
And you went in the kitchen with John and spent half of the night talking about food and talking with my cousins. That was the most I remember him saying, "Remember, you're an Armenian."
Mm-hmm. No, but there's one thing that John had that is unusual now that I think about it. One of many million things is he absolutely was not race conscious. You could come from Pluto and he wouldn't even know. He'd probably just ask, "Where did my friend come from?" Nothing mattered. He connected. He was the most personable person ever. I know when Lenny Bruce came to town, he always would come to John's and pick his brain, because Lenny needed new lines, and John always was the funniest man in the world.
Billy, tell us a little bit about the funeral. There were thousands of people there from all walks of life.
Oh, God, I'm not good with funerals. I don't really remember too much. John was... That was not a part of John. John was gone. People came and talked, and it just went past me. No, you just miss John. You don't remember what other people missed, because he was too alive. And if there's a hereafter and I get to the same place, I'm going to sock him for leaving so soon.
Hi, I'm Joan Agajanian Quinn, and I want to thank all of the people who were here today, all of John Altoon's friends who came to help the Junior Achievement of Armenia at their fundraiser at Christie's. Let me just read you one thing from Walter Hopps, who was one of the owners of the Ferris Gallery. John Altoon was never really a person who walked around. He had his way of moving everywhere with a kind of solid, bouncy float. It occurs to me that I never heard him move. Just this voice and this loud laugh. Thanks again, and thanks to all the people who were here today telling us anecdotes about John Altoon, and thanks to Patricia Faure for letting us use her gallery.